Another, we talked about it, mentioned it briefly at the beginning. Another issue that's happening in the UK is censorship.
Yeah.
She's gotten to another level.
The reason the censorship is happening is because all of these problems that we've been talking about, the economic decline, the grooming gangs, the problem with radical Islam, are being suppressed because the authorities are very worried about what would happen if people really knew all of the truth. That's what's happening.
But how did we get here? And I'll give you some examples, and maybe for the audience. Lucy, she was sentenced to almost 3 years for saying mass deportation now, set fire to all these effing hotels full of BS for all I care. If that makes me racist, so be it. It's an appalling post. But you go to jail for 3 years for a post. And the list goes on. Here, someone...
And by the way, people are not being put in jail for things like viewing child pornography. They don't get a jail sentence for that.
They actually don't. Hold on. You don't get sentenced to jail if you watch child porn?
Correct. So Hugh Edwards, the newsreader who was found to have done that, did not go to jail.
And he was found guilty?
Yeah.
And Lucy went to jail for that tweet?
Yeah.
How did we get here?
Well, I talked about what Blair did to undermine the justice system and undermine traditional British liberties by bringing in things like the Human Rights Act. So what's happened is we've created a system where the human rights of criminals appear to be more important than the human rights of law-abiding Britons. And that was created by Blair. And of course, Keir Starmer is a human rights lawyer, and he was part of that development of the culture that we've seen. So these can all be traced back. This can all be traced back to what the Blair government did. And the big mistake of the Conservatives was not reversing that.
But then what would be a solution to this? Because it feels like it's just been so ingrained.
Well, the solution is pretty obvious. You've got to repeal the Human Rights Act. You've got to get rid of the Supreme Court. You've got to restore accountability to the judiciary. You need to appoint police chiefs who are actually responsive to Parliament. That's what you've got to do. Because what we've got at present is a load of institutions in Britain that have been captured by ideology that is just antithetical to our whole way of life. There has to be big change. And this is what people want to see happening.
One last thing I want to get your thoughts on is what we're seeing in Ukraine. Especially with Trump's new approach. You've been a vocal advocate of the president. What do you think of the way he's just dealing with those issues when it comes to Ukraine war, and the way one day he criticizes Zelensky, next day he criticizes Putin? Is that just negotiation? I also want to get your thoughts on the war on China and the tariff war that he's begun and that's ongoing right now. 2 points, both we could talk about for an hour, but I would love to get your quick thoughts on each, and mainly focusing on Trump's approach relative to your expectations before he became president.
So Trump, with respect to Ukraine and Russia, he is trying to sort this out. And I think everybody agrees that the war needs to end and the bloodshed needs to end. What I want to see is pressure now put on Russia to come to the table and end the war. And one good thing that has happened is the way that President Trump has been producing oil and essentially lowering the oil price, because that is putting real economic pressure on Putin. And I think it is ultimately only the economic pressure that will actually force Putin to get a deal. The problem with Biden is he didn't have an end game. There was no strategy about how the war would actually end. So what I want to see is the war being I want to see pressure put on Russia, and I want to see the war brought to the end. On China, China has cheated, they've lied in the international system for years. They should never have been allowed to join the World Trade Organization in 2000. It's been a massive cause of the destabilization of the West, probably the #1 cause. And I think China is the #1 threat in the world. And the tariffs are a blunt instrument, but what's the alternative strategy for dealing with China? Because at present, they are eating everybody's lunch, breakfast, and dinner. And I think Trump is right to pursue the tariff strategy. And it's also part of the reason for also targeting other countries that could be the gateway for Chinese goods. In the same way as I think economic pressure needs to be put on Russia, economic pressure needs to be put on China. And for too long, the West was taking the cheap Russian gas, taking the cheap Chinese goods, and emboldening and empowering them. And now we have a situation where China has immense military prowess. Russia is pursuing an appalling war in Ukraine, and we need to do things differently. And I think the Trump approach is the only approach going.
You've been critical about China for a while. You were critical on TikTok a while ago. You were critical towards Huawei as well. The same question I asked about censorship in the UK. Do you think we're at a point of no return in being able to deal with China because they've just become too big and we do live in a multipolar world?
No, because I think ultimately freedom will win. And China is, becoming less entrepreneurial. They've cracked down on, their businesses. It's not a great place to. Before, a lot of Western companies were locating in China. They're now diversifying out of China into countries like India and Vietnam because of the Chinese approach, and also because of the tough line that Trump is taking. So I don't think it's inevitable, but the West needs to stop navel gazing and killing our own freedoms and start dealing with the enemy, which is China.
Yeah, we don't want. JD Vance said to the EU that, I can't remember the exact quote, but the enemy is within.
Yeah.
Stop looking at Russia. And I think that's a fair point. Like, you just got to look at I wouldn't call China an enemy, but the rival China.
Yeah.
If
we don't have confidence in our own values, our own beliefs, our own way of life, then how on earth are we going to wage economic war on our enemies? How on earth are we going to do that?
When we're having war with each other instead, internally.